knowledge. First of all, on behalf of NaadAura, I welcome Dr. Mark Laver, Dr. Damani Phillips from Iowa, Dr. David Claman from New York, and Dr. Monica Serra from Italy, Dr. Renu Johri from India, and Mr. Shivannand Maharaj from Port-au, Spain, and my disciple, Mr. Vincent Kelley from Philadelphia, and Mr. Praveen Kumar and Acharya Jagriti, Pandit Digrin Chandra Pathak, Professor Ravi Sharma, Dr. Sunil Bhushan Sharan from Delhi. I am very grateful to all my dear friends and my disciple, Mr. Vincent. To inaugurate anything, we start with the worship of gods, Ma Saraswati in Indian culture. As tabla playing is my mode, so I will present a Saraswati praise paran to all of you. Dhagannar dhagattan dhati dha kardan kardate kadagad ganadhati dha dhiga da kata dhirgada dhirgada tak tak datta tak dikta tak ton dam 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 tak dikta kardan nanang taga ta ta at chandra nanang chandri rinaval na Saraswati hans vaini brahmani dhirgada tak tagana dhirgada tak tagana deta ga vidya gyan gata gandha ta granth देवी जय जय वदंती जय जय दिगंतदा जयति जयति जय 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 प्रणाम धा जयति जयति जय 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 प्रणाम धा जयति जयति जय 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 प्रणाम. Thank you. Now I would hand over the stage to Acharya Jagriti to the session.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rishitosh. Hello, everybody. I am Jagriti, the Organizing Secretary of this international webinar. I welcome Chairperson Dr. Mark Laver and Dr. David Claman, Resource Person Dr. Monica Serra, Vincent Kelley, Dr. Shivannand Swami, and Renu Johri, Moderator Mr. Praveen Kumar, and the audience of today's webinar. I take immense pleasure in inviting Dr. Damani Phillips from USA as the special presence of this online session. Dr. Damani Phillips is a native of Portac, MI, and currently serves as a Director of Jazz Studies and Associate Professor of African American Studies at the University of Iowa. Phillips has earned Bachelor and Masters of Music degree from DePaul University and the University of Kentucky in Classical Saxophone, a second Master of Music degree in Jazz Studies from Wayne State University, and the Doctor of Musical Arts degree in Jazz Study at the University of Colorado at Boulder, becoming the first African American in the country to do so. An active performer, pedagogue, and lecturer, Phillips has taught and performed throughout the world. He has previously served on the faculty of Grinnell College and Oakland University, and is actively sought as a guest artist, clinician, presenter, and adjudicate throughout the nation. He has performed with artist groups such as Louis Nash, Christian McBride, Gordon, Bobby McFerrin, Marcus, Terrell Stafford, Hank Jones, and Pat Binacci, among many others. He has released 5 albums as a leader and published his first book, What Is This Thing Called Soul? Conversion on Black Culture and Jazz Education in 2017. This was a short introduction about Dr. Damani Phillips. I would like to invite him to share his knowledge with us and enlighten the audience. Please, Dr. Damani.
Thank you for the invitation, Dr. Kumar and NaadAura, for allowing me to speak with your with the people who have decided to attend the webinar. I'll keep this brief because I know that there is a fantastic slate of presenters that's lined up to begin the webinar, so I won't keep you long from that. But I'm heartened by the fact that you are having this webinar and using the arts as a means of overcoming adversity. I think we all have shared some common experiences that have been difficult to address or to deal with over the past year in particular. And in the African American community, the arts have served a particularly central role in our ability as a people, as a culture, to cope with difficult circumstances. That's been the case since the very beginning of our time in the United States, since the days of slavery. And it is to the point where it is tightly interwoven with the very definition of what African American culture is. And oddly enough, or ironically enough, I think in recent years, African Americans have begun to disconnect or have taken for granted the power that the arts can potentially serve in dealing with difficult circumstances. Once upon a time, it was quite popular. But as we got through into the 1970s and onwards, we started to lose touch a little bit with that. And so as we all work to address the realities, the difficult realities of the pandemic in particular, and the losses that go along with it, and the difficulties of isolation and, feelings of, uncertainty that are difficult for us to handle as people. This is the first condition that I've ever, at least in my lifetime, where we as a planet were equally affected by it. And while I do not wish this kind of condition on anyone, even my worst enemy, because of the difficulties that go along with it, I was remarking to a friend that there is the potential for something great to happen as we finally begin to navigate our way out of that situation. I see the arts as actually coming to a new bloom here in the days to come, as people reach to find ways to express the situations and the circumstances and the grief and the remorse and all the any number of adjectives to describe the difficulty of the situations that we've all shared as a planet over the last year. And so I am hopeful that we will once again, not just African Americans, but all people, find a way to rekindle our relationship with the ability of the arts to speak in a very unique and very potent way to conditions and circumstances that are going on in our country. And I do truly believe that on a world scale, we're going to see a massive bloom in, creative arts outpouring, and people using the arts as a means of expressing those difficult things that do not communicate so well in spoken or verbal speech. And so while we are coming out of one of the more difficult times in our lifetime, there also is the potential for this to be one of the most fertile and most creatively invigorating times as well. And so webinars of this nature are important for us to consider those possibilities as a collective whole, as a planet, not just as individual races or individual pockets of people in different parts of the world, but as a collective, because we shared this common, what's what I'm looking for, negative circumstance. And I'm hoping that we as a collective whole can find a way to use the arts to respond to it properly and in a way that enriches the world and uplifts the world as we've come from one of our darkest days and hopefully into a period of brightness when it comes to creativity and art, and even on a personal human level. So thank you for the invitation to make this these short comments at the beginning of your day today. And I am looking forward to seeing what our presenters have to say as we all begin this path of attempting to band together using the arts as kind of a common thread in how we choose to respond to the realities of what we've dealt with over the past year. So thank you again, Dr. Kumar, for the invitation, NaadAura as well. And without further ado, I will end here and hand it over to the presenters, the first presenters for the day. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak.
Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your precious words. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Praveen Kumar, Deputy Secretary at Parliament of India, to proceed the webinar.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am very happy to be invited in this grand occasion of international webinar being organized by NaadAura. First of all, I would like to start the first session by introducing our chairperson, Mark Laver. Mark Laver is a saxophonist and ethnomusicologist. He is an assistant professor of music at Grinnell College, where he directs the jazz band and teaches classes on jazz and popular music. As a performer, Dr. Laver has shared the stage with such leading jazz and improvising artists as Lee Konitz, William Parker, Dong Won Kim, A.D. Prevost, Nicole Mitchell, Annette Cohen, Antonio Sanchez, Ellen Fullman, and Phil Simmons. He has also been a featured soloist with the Kingston Symphony Orchestra, the Guelph Symphony Orchestra, the Royal Conservatory Orchestra, and the Central Iowa Symphony. Dr. Laver's current research is a biography of iconic Canadian clarinetist, composer, and educator Phil Simmons. His first book, Jazz Sells, Music, Marketing, and Meaning, explores the use of jazz music in advertising, marketing, and branding. His second book project was a collection of essays co-edited with Dr. Ajay Heble called Improvisation and Music Education Beyond the Classroom. His academic articles have appeared in Jazz Perspectives, Black Music Research Journal, Popular Music and Society, Popular Music, and Critical Studies in Improvisation. His work has been featured or profiled in the Washington Post, Talent, Fortune Magazine, Times for Higher Education, TEDx Grinnell, USA Today, College, BBC Radio 3, and CNN.com. Dr. Laver is a research associate with the International Institute for Critical Studies in Improvisation. He completed his PhD in ethnomusicology at the University of Toronto in 2011. So now I would invite Dr. Laver to begin the first session of this webinar, day 2. Dr. Mark Laver.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. Thank you to NaadAura and to Dr. Rishitosh Kumar in particular for inviting me to participate today. It's a great privilege and honor to be here to share my work and to hear what so many other leading scholars from around the world, scholars and artists from around the world are doing and thinking, and with regards to this very important theme, especially as Dr. Phillips has illuminated for us at this particular moment in time, when so many of us are facing such strident and global adversity. If I may, I'm going to attempt to share a presentation here. Oh, maybe this won't work. Here we go. Are you able to see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So this is work that grows out of my research as a and performance, I suppose, as a longtime practitioner of improvised music and jazz in particular, as well as a teacher of the art and craft of improvisation. At Grinnell, evidently my teaching encompasses classroom work that focuses on improvisation. I teach improvisation classes, including the one that Dr. Rishitosh generously visited in the fall of this past year. I also do a lot of work in the community with children, with children in the K-12 program, and this is particularly important in a town like Grinnell, and for that matter, I think in the United States, where improvisation is not taught sufficiently as a mode of musical practice in the schools. There's a great deal of emphasis on reading notated music, so with a music stand in front of you, but much less emphasis placed on what is ultimately a much more expansive and much more global practice in improvisation. And for that reason, improvisation is often, especially in the United States context, and I think in North American and Western European context, probably more generally, improvisation is often felt by inexperienced practitioners as being something that's very frightening. Kids often tell me, and my students at the college as well often tell me, that improvisation is a pretty terrifying experience for a number of reasons. Depending on the context, the rules might be the rules for navigating in an improvisatory fashion might feel impenetrable or arcane, difficult to understand, that there's a lot to learn before you get to a point that you can be a competent improviser. Or there might be no rules, which is equally overwhelming because you don't even know students don't even know where to get in. You have to, there's an emphasis on spontaneity. You have to make music up more or less off the top of your head, mostly by yourself. And because there's this feeling of exposure, there's fear that you might make a mistake, or you might sound stupid, or everybody might laugh at you. So there are a lot of potentially frightening, potentially overwhelming aspects to participating as an improviser in a group. So what that means is that everybody who is participating in a collective improvisatory scenario, especially if that scenario involves less experienced musicians, tends to be feeling vulnerable. So as an educator, and I think this is where this work intersects with the theme for the conference, as an educator, my first job is to demonstrate that everybody is feeling in the same way. So to transform those feelings of vulnerability and anxiety that can be very atomizing, that can make us feel separate from one another and fearful of one another almost, is in fact a shared and common experience. That vulnerability isn't dissipated, isn't unique to each sort of node in the each individual person who's participating in an improvisatory experience, but rather it's distributed, it's shared among the group. So everybody is feeling anxious together, and everybody is feeling vulnerable together. So then the work for me as an educator, and this comes out of lots of other work that's come out of the UK and the United States in particular, but that the work that we're doing is not only to learn how to improvise, but it's also to learn how to take care of one another in this improvisatory scenario. So this is a particularly rich kind of feeling of vulnerability and anxiety, because it can work to transform this sort of individual crisis of, fearful participation in, or, reluctant participation maybe in music making, into a kind of collective solidarity. It turns this individual crisis into a potential moment for collective solidarity. Because in admitting vulnerability in ourselves and recognizing it in our shared collective, it means that we're no longer isolated. It raises the stakes for this act of taking care. And specifically what we're taking care of, and I'll go back maybe to the previous slide where you can see at least part of the circle. Typically when we're working together in a classroom setting, I asked the group to sit in a circle, because that means that everybody is making eye contact with one another. And it also means that when we're projecting sound out into the middle of the space. And this idea of the space in the middle is an important one, because it's the space in the middle where the social and the musical interaction happens. That we're as we're engaging with each other socially and navigating this potentially, fraught and vulnerable situation, that navigation happens in the middle of the group, and the sounds, as we project them into the middle, are also sort of intermingling in the middle space. So that middle space becomes an important kind of metaphorical and practical area, because it's the site of this navigation and of this move from crisis to solidarity. So when we're taking care of each other, we're taking care of the music that's happening in the middle, and we're also taking care of the social circumstances. We're also taking care of the humanity of the music makers as it is sort of manifest in the music. So what that means is that when I'm teaching improvisation, I'm certainly teaching the rules of improvisation in a given context. So if we're working on jazz, we'll talk about harmony and chords and scales and rhythm and groove. But we're also talking about teaching a disposition towards improvisation. We work on listening, right, and thinking about how we can navigate between the act of listening and the act of sound creation, and what the implications of those two things are for that music that's happening in the middle, right? Like, if there's a lot of sound happening in the middle, should I be contributing to it, or would I be better to sit out and just listen for a little while? As we figure out how to negotiate that dynamic between listening and making sound, we work towards a process of co-creation, so of building something together. So again, putting an emphasis on figuring out how to work together as a collective, figuring out how to build something together. And in so doing, what we're in fact working on is empathy. We're working on figuring out how to recognize and support this sort of vulnerability and anxiety, maybe that I mentioned earlier, and others. We're reflecting our own sort of feelings of vulnerability and anxiety. We're materializing that those feelings in sound, and interacting with others. So it's a if we do it right, it's a way of practicing music, but also practicing empathy, which, as we move towards trying to figure out how art can be a kind of a mode of dealing with adversity. Empathy is a critical aspect of this process. So what that means then further is that improvisation, when we're practicing improvisation, it's not only a tool for working on music. It's also a tool for working on society, working on social relations. So the lessons that students learn from improvisation then are eminently transferable. That space in the middle doesn't necessarily need to be conceived of as an exclusively musical space, because it's also at the same time a social space. So in a musical scenario, the interchange of sounded ideas is a material manifestation of relations between people improvising together. When you take away the sound, the relations are still there, but they're less audible. So collective improvisation is a way of practicing listening, speaking, and empathy. But the space in the middle could be ultimately any kind of communicated experience. So this isn't like a phenomenon that's unique to music. It just happens to be, I think, particularly sort of crystalline in music. The space in the middle could be any kind of communicated experience where process is the focus, where our goal is to rehearse the kind of mechanics of being together, the mechanics of communication. So these skills are also similarly cultivated in and eminently transferable to other kinds of classroom experiences, for instance, like a seminar on gender and sexuality studies, or on French literature, or on philosophy. So from the broadest perspective, it implicates democracy, the way that we operate together in a democratic system of governance. As the American education scholar and philosopher John Dewey wrote in an important book, Democracy and Education, in 1816, this is a foundational text for the rationale for public education in the United States, effectively. A democracy is more than a form of government, Dewey writes. It is primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. Associated living and conjoint communicated experience. So democracy is not just about like the institutions of democracy. It's not just about the Capitol buildings, or it's not just about our congressional or parliamentary representatives. It's about the way that we choose to live together in the world, and the way that we choose to communicate with each other in the world. So because democracy is a process, and one that is constantly in flux because of all of the many actors that are involved, democratic citizenship isn't something that's just fixed. It's something that we need to work on. And so the tools of associated living and conjoint communicated experience that Dewey identifies, these are tools that need to be cultivated. We can't just sort of trust to our institutions to take care of democracy for us. We all need to be thriving participants. So improvised music is not just a metaphor for democracy. It can be a place where we can actively and intentionally cultivate techniques of thought and feeling that will enrich a kind of interior citizenship that is predicated on dialogue and empathy, a kind of citizenship of the heart. So this is Matt Bevin, former governor of Kentucky. One of the factors that has put in recent years, really recent decades, is a systematic devaluing around the world of music education and arts education more broadly, and in fact even humanistic education, because of a sense that the purpose of education is singularly quantifiable, right? That it's coterminous basically with its market value. I have these conversations with parents all the time at admissions events for my college, where a parent will say, my kid has been playing the violin since they were 3 years old, and they love music, and they want nothing else to do but play music, but there's no work in music, so there's no point in getting a degree in music. So this kind of sentiment plays out in lots of different places, and it's emphasized and has been emphasized by our political leaders. And in a U.S. context in particular, somebody like former state of Kentucky Governor Matt Bevin argued, I think on the campaign trail in 2016, that there should be less state funding for arts education. He said there will be more incentives to electrical engineers than French literature majors. There just will, because all the people in the world that want to study French literature can do so, but they're just not going to be subsidized by the taxpayer. Because in his estimation, the study of literature, right, is not useful. It doesn't have you can't make money from it, and you can't contribute to the economy as a French literature scholar. Former presidential candidate and Florida Senator Marco Rubio, also on the campaign trail in 2016, suggested that philosophy was a useless field of study. He said that so you can decide if it's worth borrowing $50,000 to major in Greek philosophy, because after all, the market of for Greek philosophers has been very tight for 2,000 years. So he's being sarcastic here. He's suggesting that it's not worth borrowing money to study philosophy, because it's not going to get you a job. It's not going to make you money, and it's not going to contribute to the economy. And so this, of course, has played out. And apologize for this. Apologies for the potentially profane image here, but this is played out in at higher levels of U.S. policy, where the organizations that are meant to fund artistic practice, like the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, have all been subject to increased budget cuts in the United States government for generations, crystallizing really in the recent Donald Trump government, where there were multiple proposals over the course of that of those 4 years to eliminate these programs entirely. So in the estimation of Donald Trump, Betsy DeVos, and other American political actors, there should be no government funding whatsoever for the arts. So when we think about the role that the arts has played, that I spoke to in the first half of this talk, as a way of cultivating empathy, cultivating listening, cultivating a kind of citizenship that's grounded in those skills and practices, as a way of practicing those critical aspects of democratic citizenship and membership. The fact that the leaders around the world, and it's not only in the United States, of course, I mean, we could equally look at Brazil, we could equally look at the Philippines, places around the world where these kinds of, so-called strongman leaders have emerged as sort of powerful men whose leadership is predicated on sort of single-mindedness and a refusal to listen. It seems that these two things are related, right? The devaluing of arts education, the rise of sort of fascist populism around the world, effectively, of entrenched partisanship in global governments, of electoral support for populist leadership that scorns listening, that those two things are not unrelated. Because what does it say about the state of democratic citizenship in the US, for instance, that somewhere between 39 and 45% of Americans continue to support what is, effectively a fascist kind of government, where senators and congressional representatives would sooner torpedo the fiscal and social well-being of the nation than surrender partisan advantage. And we see this, like, again, in the last few weeks in the way that half of U.S. congressional representatives refused to support a policy that would what are the words that I'm looking for here? A policy that would more effectively have supported Americans trying to survive the coronavirus pandemic. Where the news, as it is reported by media outlets, is targeted towards consumer demographics at opposing ends of the political spectrum, and that news is so divergent that you're left to wonder if we're even talking about the same country. What does it say about the work we have to do on the process of democracy, on the space in the middle, that all of these things have been allowed to happen? So playing in a jazz ensemble, or studying philosophy, or studying French literature or gender studies or whatever else, it might not guarantee you a job. It might not guarantee, there's not a kind of burgeoning jazz tech sector, for instance, that my students can automatically step out into when they graduate from Grinnell College. My improvisation class probably won't score you a sweet unpaid summer internship with a management consultancy firm. But you'll learn how to listen, how to really listen. You'll learn how to build something together that makes you feel happy and proud and fulfilled. And when you improvise and play music together with other people, you'll start to develop skills and dispositions that will make you a better citizen and a better person, who might even help make the world a little better. So that's what the arts are for. That's what the humanities are for. And that's how they can cultivate a kind of resiliency in the face of adversity. Because it can make us more empathetic, more thoughtful, and more empowered, potentially. And it can strengthen the human bonds of citizenship. So in a very deliberate way, arts education can contribute to the long, slow healing of the fractures and fissures in human democracies around the world. Thank you.
Well, very nice. Very informative.
I'm happy to, I'm not sure if there's time to take questions. I'm happy to participate in a conversation or move on to the next presenter.
Okay.
गुरुजी आप चाहते हैं कि वो थोड़ा सा सवाल जवाब हो अभी या बाद में उसके बाद सवाल जवाब हो?
हाँ वो कर सकते हैं।
अभी करें? वो पूछ रहे थे मर्द जी।
जरूर, sure.
We can take questions now, Dr. Laver, if you.
Can I have a question.
Of course, please.
I just want to know, as you were saying that you were talking about improvisation.
Yeah.
And I just want to know, because to whom you are teaching this improvisation, as far as we know that Western music doesn't have any scope of improvisation in their music. So, and I just want you to know this. That's all.
I teach in predominantly a jazz context, and as I know Dr. Phillips does. And whereas improvisation has been kind of pushed out of Western European classical music over the last 150 to 200 years, it remains paramount in African American traditions. And so, I mean, that's been the scope of my participation as my involvement as an improviser has been playing jazz music primarily, and adjacent traditions. It's also why when I teach improvisation, I invite somebody like Rishitosh to teach in my classes, to give students a greater sense of how important improvisation is everywhere in the world, except in those traditions that are kind of influenced by Western Europe. So, thinking about improvisation in India, thinking about improvisation in Africa, thinking about improvisation as most importantly in African American communities, as a way to counter the kind of overarching notion that improvisation isn't important because of what they get out of their kindergarten through grade 12 education in the U.S. Does that speak to your question?
Yes, I think you're fine. This is fine.
Okay,
I got you. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, Dr. Phillips, please.
Thank you for your presentation. Listen, over the course of what you share with us, I hear the sense of, how improvisation connects with, the sense of democracy and sense of, empathy and ability to listen very carefully, and with an open mind and ear. I wonder if what you see is the connection between improvisation and cultural context and underpinnings, and whether that's an included part of what you do when you address this with your students.
Cultural context in terms of the specificity in African American communities?
Well, I'm not saying African American. I agree with you that that's going to have a big part of it, but what I'm asking is cultural underpinnings, period. In any context beyond African American culture, even, because we're not the only folks that are improvisation is central to their music.
Yeah, I mean, so in my I hope that I'm understanding your question correctly, but when we talk about improvisation, we absolutely talk about culture, in the sense that I mean, any kind of musical practice is emerges from culture. In understanding, and my understanding here of culture is the kind of extra institutional ways that people choose to interact together, and the ways that people sort of generationally inherit certain kinds of dispositions. So yeah, improvisation is in a U.S. context is a culturally contingent phenomenon that also has a kind of also appears in expansive global contexts in which it's similar to had similar kind of cultural contingencies. So the way that improvisation works in a jazz tradition is very different from the way that improvisation works in North Indian music, with different sets of rules and different sets of people that are likely or less likely to participate. So that's also a critical part of the thing. So I mean, it's to speak of it as if it's sort of one singular thing, I guess the way that I kind of did, but to speak of it as if it's one singular thing that plays out in similar ways everywhere in the world is imprecise. But there are elements of improvisatory practice that connect different kinds of global music making. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's cool. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, to be clear, most of the work that I do is in a jazz context. Is there another question?
No, I don't think so.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to share this work with you today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mark Laver. In continuation of the discussion on the role of arts in overcoming the adversity of life in a global, and very briefly summed it up, and you had made a very beautiful presentation relating to improvisation in arts and through that music and in other parts of the life of people. Now I would request Dr. Monica to share her knowledge and experience on the role of arts in our life. Dr. Monica, please.
Okay, just a moment. Yes, just a moment. A little problem with the mic. Are you hearing me?
Okay.
Fine. Okay,
Hello,
just a
everybody.
moment. Okay.
Thanks to Rishitosh for the invitation. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Monica Serra. I'm historical and iconographic consultant. I mainly deal with the medieval historical artist period. For this meet, I prefer to have translator, Dr. Raffaele Serio. Thank you very much, Raffaele.
I will try to do my best.
Okay.
Sorry for our broken English.
Ok, voglio fare una premessa.
Monica wants to do a first introduction.
Naturalmente io provengo da un retaggio culturale che è quello italiano.
Of course, Monica, and as a general, we Italians are coming from a cultural background that is the Italian one.
E quindi provenendo da una cultura classica.
And so coming from a classic culture.
Il nostro approccio.
Our approach.
Alle arti e alla cultura.
To arts and culture.
È differente dall'Occidente.
is something different in a certain way from from other Western European and especially from Northern European approach. So to say we are Latin people, and so we have this heritage of a classic culture, and our own language is based on the old Latin and also Greek language.
Ok, grazie Raffaele. Quindi io credo che per comprendere quale possa essere il ruolo delle arti nel superare le avversità della vita in un'epoca di stravolgimento globale come la nostra, credo sia necessario volgere lo sguardo al nostro passato, per quanto mi riguarda a quello classico, e porci una domanda. Cosa vuol dire arte oggi?
So, in order to understand which can be the role of art in overcoming life's adversities in a period of harsh times and global radical changes like this one we are living in, I believe necessary looking to our classical past and then asking ourselves a question: what does it mean art today?
Nell'antichità occidentale del vecchio continente, il termine latino ars, cioè arte, veniva utilizzato per identificare diversi campi e concetti dello scibile umano.
In the ancient times of Western European civilization, the Latin term ars, that is art, was used to identify different fields and concepts of human knowledge.
Ars faceva riferimento alla professione, al mestiere, ma anche all'abilità dell'uomo nel creare.
Ars was, so the Latin for art, ars was relevant to the profession, the trade, the craftsmanship, but also to man's ability and ingenuity in creating, widely intended.
Ok. Ars era anche nel mondo latino ars medica, l'arte medica, artes urbane, la giurisprudenza, ars culinaria e l'ars moriendi, l'arte del morire.
So ars was also in the Latin word ars medica, that is medicine and medical knowledge, artes urbanae, that is the Latin for jurisprudentiam or jurisprudence and lawyer's practice, of course, ars culinaria, that is cooking art, ars moriendi too, that is dying art, or knowing how to die, that is honorably.
Di cui facevano parte trattati religiosi del cristianesimo antico, contenenti esempi e insegnamenti per una buona morte.
This last, the ars moriendi, so knowing how to die, included religious practice and treatises containing examples and procedures for a good death or how to make a good end, up to the concept. Yes, okay, go on.
Tutto questo era arte.
All this was art.
Fino ad arrivare a quel concetto di artes liberales, cioè le belle arti.
All this was art up to the concept of arriving to the artes liberales, or what we know today as fine arts.
Da questo concetto possiamo dedurre che il termine ars nell'antichità occidentale non era limitato al solo fattore estetico, figurativo o di estetica della musica, ma era molto più di questo.
From these wider meanings, we can deduct that the term ars or art in the ancient times in Europe was not limited just to the aesthetic or figurative factor or to that of music aesthetics. Instead, it was much more.
L'arte era prima di tutto un'azione, un agire, per accordare la materia al mondo spirituale.
Art was first of all acting to accord and harmonize the material, that is matter, to the spiritual world.
Quindi le arti avevano una funzione di conservare la memoria già presente in ogni essere umano di un'armonia cosmica.
Thus, arts had the primary function of preserving the existing memory of every human being about a superior cosmic harmony.
Inoltre avevano la funzione di educare alla conoscenza dei mondi spirituali attraverso l'ispirazione, l'estro.
Besides this, arts had the function of teaching and educating to the knowledge of spiritual worlds through inspiration, through the word astral.
In particolare in Italia questo concetto è stato ben dimostrato in due diversi periodi storici, quello medievale, che va dall'11° al XIII secolo, e quello naturalmente rinascimentale, con la famosa triade stellare. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo Buonarroti e Raffaello Sanzio.
In Italy, this concept in particular was well demonstrated in two different historical periods. The medieval, that is Middle Age, from the 11th to the 13th centuries, and the Renaissance, with the famous stars triad, so Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raffaello.
Ok, l'arte si muoveva su due elementi fondamentali in questo periodo, la bellezza intesa come bellezza universale e l'armonia intesa come armonia cosmica.
Art was then moving and made by two fundamental elements: beauty, intended or understood as universal beauty, and harmony, understood or intended as cosmic harmony.
Questa armonia prodotta dalle arti nel periodo medievale e rinascimentale era, e credo sia oggi, vitale, di vitale importanza per l'uomo.
This harmony, as it was intended, this harmony generated by art, as it was intended in the medieval and the Renaissance, was and currently is of vital, paramount importance for mankind.
In quanto qualunque avversità l'uomo debba affrontare, l'arte intesa in questi termini porterà sempre un beneficio all'uomo e quindi la possibilità di una sua elevazione di coscienza.
This because whichever painful condition the man must bear and cope with, art understood in such a way will always bring beneficial effects and so the possibility of an elevation of conscience.
Credo che questo concetto sia oggi il punto focale. In Occidente l'arte ha perso il suo vero ruolo di bilanciatrice, di equilibrio degli elementi materiali e spirituali.
I truly believe, yes, okay, go on.
Vai.
I truly believe that this understanding is today the focal point. Art lost its real role of a real balancer or re-equilibrating element of material and spiritual elements, being slowly reduced just to an embellishment, an ornament, a decoration, or an object of disharmonious consumption.
Ok, questo oggetto di consumo che viene chiamato arte oggi è composto da disordine vibrazionale che conduce a un disagio interiore, in quanto blocca l'energia vitale dell'uomo e la sua capacità quindi ispirativa, necessaria per l'elevazione di coscienza dell'uomo e quindi di una spiritualità più alta che entra in connessione col mondo spirituale.
This consumption object made art made of vibrational disorder leads to an interior disease, blocking man's vital energy and his inspirational capability necessary to elevated moments and to an elevation of his own conscience.
Questo concetto era ben chiaro in un'Italia del periodo medievale con alcuni mistici e alcuni iniziati e nel periodo rinascimentale con Leonardo e soprattutto con Raffaello Sanzio.
This concept was very clear in the medieval and especially in the Renaissance age through some mystics and renowned artists like Leonardo, Michelangelo and Raffaello Sanzio.
Volgere lo sguardo al passato e riscoprire quelle arti che erano ricche di sapienza potrebbe oggi aiutare l'uomo a progredire nella sua crescita personale e spirituale.
So today, turning a glance to the past from a renewed discovery of those arts of that times so rich in knowledge could help man to progress in his personal research and growth.
Il passato non può e non deve essere cancellato, ma andrebbe contemplato come un'esperienza che si integra con il presente per una migliore visione del futuro.
The past can be and must not be cancelled. However, it should be seen as a splendid experience to integrate present times for a better vision of the future.
Quindi credo che il ruolo delle arti oggi sia quello di recuperare necessariamente quella bellezza universale e quell'armonia per ritrovare un equilibrio in tutte le cose visibili e invisibili che i sapienti del passato conoscevano molto bene.
I believe so that the role of arts today is one of recovering necessarily that universal beauty and that cosmic harmony once emanated in the past times from hearts to find out again the balance or the Latin term equilibrium in all things, visible and not.
Io non vedo al momento altra alternativa se non questa per potersi dirigere in un nuovo rinascimento, in una nuova età dell'oro e con un paradigma differente da quello attuale, ormai lontano dall'equilibrio tra l'estetica e l'etica, che producono un benessere interiore dell'uomo attraverso questo cambio di frequenza vibrazionale.
I can see at the moment other alternative, if not this one, in order to drive ourselves towards a new golden age and with a new paradigm, different from the current one, which is nowadays far from an equilibrium between aesthetics and ethics that produce an interior well-being through a change of vibrational frequency.
Vorrei concludere dicendo che bisogna allontanarsi da quest'arte mercificata di consumo che ha una bassa frequenza e recuperare la nostra armonia primordiale.
In conclusion, we have to detach ourselves from these low frequency consumption arts and recover instead our primordial harmony with the memory of what it was in the ancient times, in the past civilization.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Monica. You had a wonderful presentation taking us from our ancient times. Now I would leave the floor for any questions from her.
Domande per te, molto bella la tua presentazione centrata sui tempi antichi.
Grazie.
Is she from Italy?
Yes, she is from Italy.
Yes. Monica Serra, she is from Italy, yes.
And she teaches music somewhere in university or school?
Ti sta chiedendo se tu insegni musica nell'università.
Io all'università insegno storia e storia dell'arte medievale.
She is teaching,
quindi anche musica medievale.
She is teaching history and medieval history at the university and also music history, yes.
I'm very sorry, I'm just to interrupt. I'm very sorry I could not introduce her properly before giving the floor to her. Dr. Monica Serra is a historical iconographic consultant specialized in the Italian and European medieval period. She was born in a town a few kilometers from the ancient city of Naples. She graduated in scenography from the Academy of Fine Arts in Perugia. She specialized in history and history of medieval art at the University of Perugia, and she has held the position of artistic director of the film pre-post production department at the Multimedia Center of Supervisor Carlo Ranbadi. She held the role of concept artist for the film.
Okay, fine. I mean, in nutshell, she is an art historian, not a musician. Yes, I think she's an art historian. I just want you to know one thing. I just heard a few days ago that there is no music teaching classes in school in Italy. Is it right or wrong? I just want you to know.
Okay, translator.
There is no music teaching in schools in Italy. In Italy.
Okay.
Yes. Allora, in parte
yes, it's in part true.
In part, okay. I mean, it is very unfortunate. I mean, there is no music teaching in schools in Italy.
Molto triste che non vi sia un insegnamento di musica in Italia.
As in India or especially in Delhi, in all the school, whether it is government or private schools, we do have music teaching by very music teachers in Delhi schools. And it must have been very difficult in pandemic periods in Italy, especially where school doesn't have any teaching system, especially to the kids, especially to the children. It must have been very difficult for their creativity and therefore for their in this difficult time, especially in Italy. Whereas in India, we do have in many creativities. Still, it is going on in schools through music and through art and many other things. I'm wondering what would have happened to the children in Italy, where there is no creativity in schools. I just want you to know.
Ecco, vorrebbe sapere appunto che siccome non viene insegnata la musica in Italia in questo periodo in particolare di difficoltà, mentre invece in India, a Delhi, queste invece classi di musica ci sono, e quindi specialmente considerando un paese come l'Italia legato alla musica e all'arte, si chiede quali guasti questo possa causare.
Allora, cito un personaggio molto importante che si chiama Rudolf Steiner.
Citing a very important person like Rudolf Steiner,
che 100 anni fa disse:
100 years ago he said,
l'Italia traccia la strada.
Italy is leading the way.
Io credo che ciò che sta accadendo in Italia
I believe that what is happening
è un
in Italy,
esperimento
it's an experiment
basato sul carattere dell'italiano.
Based on the Italians' characters and personality.
Il carattere italiano, la personalità italiana è sempre stata.
The Italian personality, the Italian behavior has always been.
È sempre stata una personalità di aggregazione.
An aggregation personality. An inspirational one.
E quindi di solidarietà.
And so solidarity one.
Di grandi stimoli artistici e musicali.
Giving big inputs on the part of arts and music.
Quindi l'attacco feroce.
So the ferocious attack
che stanno facendo sui ragazzi nelle scuole italiane.
That in these moments, in these current times, they are doing to the pupils in Italian schools.
Credo che sia uno dei più pesanti in questa situazione.
Seems to be one of the heavier facts that we are bearing in this situation caused by the isolation due to the COVID disease.
Per diminuire la loro capacità di aggregazione e quindi di stimolo alle loro arti.
And this is diminishing.
Del loro DNA.
Yes, and this is diminishing their capability, the pupils' capability of aggregation, of inspiration, of cooperating in the creation effort that is also something that is collective and needs also to be together.
I danni che questo può causare.
The damages that this can produce
sono molteplici.
Are tenfold, are multiple.
Quello che stiamo osservando nei ragazzi oggi.
What we are observing today in Italy, in the pupils, in the young people,
è una psicopatia.
It's something of a psychopathy.
Che produce una socialità, una paura dell'altro.
That is producing an asociality, a sort of fear of one to the other.
Però c'è un però.
But
siamo italiani.
There is a but, and the but is, luckily, we are Italians.
L'italiano ha la capacità
and as Italians,
di trasformare
as we fuzzy Italians, we
Il
have the
negativo
capability of transforming the negative facts
in una sua opportunità
into something of an opportunity
di rialzarsi velocemente
of coming back to something better.
più grande è l'attacco,
The greater is the attack, the greater is the difficulty,
più forte sarà la reazione.
the stronger will be the reaction from the Italians.
È nel carattere italiano.
And this is truly in the Italian personality and history and character.
Quindi ho molta fiducia nei giovani
So
che
Monica has faith and is aware that the young people in the end,
che se indirizzati
if well oriented, if well addressed,
avranno una maggiore capacità di uscirne
they will have
più forti
an higher capacity of coming out from this period stronger
e magari anche più creativi.
and better equipped,
Per loro è
especially
uno stimolo.
on the creative side, and this could be an input, a push towards something even more creative. It could be it could be a sort of little new renaissance.
Ok, l'italiano purtroppo
Nevertheless, the Italian
ha bisogno di questo tipo di stimolo
unfortunately, the Italians need this kind of input
per potersi reinventare.
to reinvent themselves. So, as a national character, the Italian need to go down and then coming up again. It's something that history has taught us very well.
Abbiamo sempre avuto questa capacità
We
e non la
always said
perderemo adesso.
we always had in times this capability, and I believe truly that we will not lose this capability today.
Okay. I got your point. Okay, thank you.
Thank you to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Monica Serra, for a beautiful presentation of arts with the music and the history and taking us from the ancient and medieval times. And thank you so much, Dr. Raphael, for explaining what he explained to us. Because without your presence, we would have missed it. Now,
thank you very much.
I would just invite Mr. Vincent Kelley, who is a musician, a researcher, and a writer based in Philadelphia, USA. He has completed degree from Grinnell College and King's College, London, and is currently a PhD student in ethnomusicology at the University of Pennsylvania. Vincent was also a Fulbright Nehru Scholar in Delhi. He is a jazz drummer and a tabla disciple of Dr. Rishitosh Kumar and has performed across US and India at several places. Mr. Vincent, please take the floor and explain it in your version.
Thank you so much.
Can be useful. Yes.
Thank you, everybody, for sticking around for this presentation. It's been great to hear what both Dr. Laver and Dr. Serra have to say, and I hope I'll be able to do some justice to following them right now with my brief presentation today. I just want to thank, in particular, my Guruji for organizing this this panel, and it means a lot to be invited to speak here, and also to see that some of my other teachers and mentors, particularly Dr. Damani Phillips and Dr. Mark Laver, also in attendance. Really is a beautiful thing to see people coming together like this, and I thank everybody for the opportunity to speak here. I'm going to try and share my screen as well. Oops. I'm not able to share my screen at the moment. Mark, was there something you did? I'm saying I don't have permission at the moment.
I clicked present now, and then I shared a window.
A window, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I see Dr. Phillips' comment there. If people have some questions, it seemed like there were some other questions on the previous presentation, maybe while I figure out the tech side of things here.
Actually, I had a question regarding the presentation presented earlier. Could I ask the question?
Yes, sure.
Hello, everyone. Hello, ma'am. I just wanted to know that Italian Renaissance period has been marked as one of the greatest epoch in the history, and it has produced one of the finest painters, artists, and fine art artists in overall. However, we see the lack of history as well as mathematics during the time of Renaissance. So, music as well. So, why do you think music couldn't develop in Italy as other form of arts developed in Italy so well during the time of Renaissance? So could you highlight some of the points which led to the downfall of music, or like why music couldn't grow as a part of a fine art during the time of Renaissance?
Ok. La musica non è rimasta indietro.
Monica Serra is saying that in the Renaissance in Italy, yes, really the music was not left behind.
L'Italia ha avuto diversi periodi.
Italy had several periods.
Ogni periodo,
in every period,
ha avuto il suo personaggio per un'iniziazione.
Italy had his own character, his own person for an initiation.
Diversa per ogni artista.
Different for every artist.
La musica in Italia,
music in Italy,
si è sviluppata in diversi periodi,
in different periods,
nei quali c'era bisogno,
in which there was the need,
una comunicazione differente da quella rinascimentale.
Of a different communication, different from the Renaissance one.
Abbiamo avuto esempi di musica medievale molto importante e quindi di comunicazione attraverso il suono.
We had examples of medieval music, very important ones, so examples of communication through the sound.
Mentre nel Rinascimento,
while during the Renaissance,
la comunicazione doveva necessariamente essere quella figurativa.
Necessarily had to be the figurative one.
Attraverso la visione.
Through the vision.
Che il popolo doveva avere, nonostante fosse
that the people have to add,
analfabeta rispetto a concetti molto ampi.
Being not educated in respect to very elevated concepts.
La musica era elitaria.
Music was considered as elitary, so reserved for few people, while the figurative arts had a wider impact over also not educated people, and also was didascalic, that is showing the concepts, coming to the God and describing the religious aspects and so on.
Ok, la musica in Italia ha avuto molte influenze, essendo al centro del Mediterraneo, ha avuto un'influenza comunicativa in diversi momenti storici. Questi momenti storici ci hanno portato a un'esplosione musicale in tempi ben dopo il Rinascimento.
Music in Italy, being at the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, at different periods, but this evolution led to an explosion of flourishment and of music successes and musicians well after the Renaissance age.
Ma il periodo rinascimentale doveva essere un periodo di comunicazione differente.
And the Renaissance age was a period of different communication
che aveva a che fare con arti differenti dalla musica, quindi una comunicazione più visiva.
To do with arts different from music, and so not with sound but with a visual approach.
Non dimentichiamoci
it is not to be forgotten that
che prima del Rinascimento,
before the Renaissance,
la musica era legata a certi ambienti.
Music was linked to certain circles and environments.
Veniva applicata nelle corti.
It was something elitary. It was something that was played and cultivated in courts. And so around, the kings, around the few educated people, and not
nei riti religiosi.
And in religious.
Thank you, Dr. Monica. I think Mr. Rai has got the answer to his question. Now I would request Mr. Vincent to go ahead with the program, because we have number of very senior speakers to share this forum. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
everybody. Can everyone see this on their screen?
Yes, we can see the role of art in our life.
Excellent. All right. So when I was told about this presentation topic and the theme for this event, as well as for the panel in particular, there's nothing in my work that I really had prepared. So I thought, what would be the best way to address this topic in a way that would connect with the people that we have from many different countries, cultures, and civilizations here present in this panel. And I'd like to discuss what I'm calling a people's perspective on the role of art in our life through the lens of three different artists, Max Roach, Munshi Premchand, and Luke Kelley. So in my thinking about what the word role means in the context of this panel, I think that the use of this word entails some suggestion of an idea of a purpose for art beyond just art for art's sake. So a purpose for art beyond just what we as artists or musicians or dancers or painters realize within the immediacy of our artistic practice, but something that connects to the world and perhaps even impacts the world in a broader manner. So I think that the perspectives of these three artists, these three thinkers, Max Roach, Munshi Premchand, and Luke Kelley, have a lot to teach us about overcoming adversity through art, and in particular about this perennial question of the relationship between art and life. So I'd like to advance 3 different perspectives inspired by these thinkers in this brief presentation. The first, the idea that art can reflect and change reality. The second, that art should be for both beauty and justice. And the third, of art as service to the people. So I think, as some of the other presentations have gotten at quite clearly, there's something about our particular condition right now, a condition of the modern or even postmodern world that has really been exacerbated by the isolation created in the context of the pandemic, that has made many of us realize that there is something missing in our lives, in that, with all of this rapid development and technological change that we experience, there is still something lacking in our connection with other people and our relationship even to ourselves. And I think that one of the great roles of art is that it has a certain degree of eternity, or can have a certain degree of eternity, that is simply missing from our highly technological society. So first, I'd like to discuss briefly Max Roach, who lived from 1924 to 2007. And this is a picture of him performing at the drums later in his life. Max Roach was a very important African-American drummer who played a pivotal role in the development of many different styles or genres within what the music we call as jazz today, including bebop, more free jazz, and I would also argue on the drum set itself. There is hardly a musician who has had a bigger impact on the development of the drum set, I think, in the 20th century than Max Roach himself, and particularly his ability to perform melodically on the drum set, not just using it as a percussion instrument in the traditional sense, but actually pulling melodies out of the drums themselves. And because of the topic here, I won't get too much into his actual playing techniques, but I did want to quote something that he said in the 1984 interview that is quite important, I believe, that he did as a part of a project to archive jazz and African-American music at Howard University in 1984. So one thing he said in that interview was that culture serves more than one purpose. It's for enlightenment, it's for entertainment, it's to relax with, it's to think by, it's to worship by, and so forth. So what I like about this is the idea that art really can, as they say, be all things to all men, or to be something different or specific to each situation that we find ourselves in, or each form of adversity, perhaps. Sometimes we need art for different kinds of adversities. The anxiety that Dr. Laver was talking about, or particularly as a way to think beyond just the structures of communication and writing and speaking, as Dr. Phillips mentioned in his introduction. And I think this sort of all-encompassing aspect of art and culture is very important to keep in mind, that it's not just one part of our life or something that is in addition or instead of the main tendencies within our life, but also, in fact, an integral part of every aspect of it. And in particular, what Max Roach researched in this interview is on the importance of reality and the clear and truthful representation of reality through art. And this was a time in the United States when pop music in particular was becoming very commercialized. And he mentions the rise of disco in particular as a form of dance music that really is about entertainment or having fun or partying, and all of those things, which, as he suggests in his first statement, there's nothing wrong with that, but there needs to be art as well that can actually bring us back to reality in a culture that is dominated by fantasy. And through much of his music, he tried to address these questions that we face, particularly in America, surrounding racism, joblessness, war, police brutality, among other issues, through his instrument and through his collaborations with other artists. And through this, he tried to provide a counterbalance to a mainstream commercialized pop culture that really tries to lull the mass of people to sleep and really not be able to confront the reality that faces them in their daily life. So I think from this, we understand that art must actually speak to life, not just be a form of escapism from it. And music has a particular role, I think, in being outside of the visual and written and sort of semantic meaning of language, that it can really actually wake us up to certain forms of reality in a way that other forms of human interaction might not be able to. So second, I'd like to address the incredible writer Munshi Premchand, who lived from 1880 to 1936. Premchand, as I'm sure many of you know, in the Indian context who are attending, was an important Hindi and Urdu writer in British India who wrote against colonialism and for social reform within Indian society. And most importantly, he was the perhaps in some ways founding member of the Progressive Writers Association, which was an artistic collective of poets, short story writers, and novelists that was founded in 1936 in Lucknow, India. And this was actually the year of his death, but he gave a very important address at the inaugural event for the founding of this organization in 1936, in which he put forth in very clear language the philosophy of art that undergirds his approach to literature. So he says in this address, among other things, that the artist is wedded to humanness, virtue, and nobility, to support and plead for the oppressed, suffering, and destitute, whether an individual or a group, is his duty. Society is his court, and he submits his plea to this country and deems his efforts successful if it arouses a sense of the aesthetic and a sense of justice. So I think here we find a very important contribution to the idea of art in our life, in the concept of using art to overcome adversity in our lives. And that is that Premchand understood art as realized not only within the aesthetics of the actual writing itself and the enjoyment and pleasures that one can receive from reading poetry or other forms of literature, but also in using the medium of literature as a part of the struggle for a more just world, particularly a world that can actually bring human dignity and upliftment spiritually and materially to the oppressed, suffering, and destitute. And I think here Premchand made a very important contribution in that he, in many ways, redefined how people think about beauty in the 20th century. It's not only just in what we would see as sort of beautiful forms, which it is also that. And I think that can't be underestimated, the importance of beautiful forms. I mean, I think some people have said a bad poem doesn't help anyone. But, he also made the insight that beauty is also part and parcel in the fight against ugliness in society. As long as the oppressed exist within society, as long as there is poverty, war, and racism and other social ills, the artist can never be satisfied in their struggle for and towards beauty. Finally, I'd like to talk about one last figure, who is Luke Kelley, who lived a short but very rich life from 1940 to 1984. Luke Kelley was an Irish singer and instrumentalist involved in the folk revival movement in the 1960s and 1970s in both Ireland and England. And, he revived many of these very old Irish folk songs that, he provided a particular voice to that many other singers of that time had not. And I think it was due to him that a lot of these songs are still with us, and that he was able to also frame many of them in a broader political context, given the conditions of the time. And this is from one interview with him, just a very brief quote that I'd like to read out. Luke Kelley said, "I would stop singing and work at any job with my hands at any time if I thought it would help improve things for people. I want to see the time coming when, say, a child will get the opportunity to use his brains." So I found this to be a very moving statement for somebody who is making his living as a musician, which he really saw as a unique privilege to be able to sing and play instruments, while many of people he grew up around in the slums of Dublin did not have this opportunity. And he saw his art as intimately connected to those people also having opportunities to overcome adversity, not only for just his individual advancement, but for his people's advancement. And he, I think, expresses in this statement the idea that the artist cannot put him or herself above the people, but rather must see art as a form of service to the people. And I think this is definitely something that we can keep in mind as artists emerging from this pandemic who have been able to make it through. Many have not. But, we really can't go back to normal, so to speak, but rather must actually think about how our art, for its very survival, and I think also for its renewed blooming, does need to have a broader connection with the people that it emerges from. So finally, in conclusion, I'd like to discuss just return to a topic that was actually brought up in Dr. Serra's presentation on the idea of looking towards the past to chart a new future. Max Roach, Munshi Premchand, and Luke Kelley, I think, provide a people's perspective on the role of art in life. And while they come from very different cultures, civilizations, and geographies, I think there is something in common that they were all striving for. And it really made me think of another meaning of what Dr. Laver discussed is the space in the middle with regard to improvisation. But there's this sort of space, I think, in the middle of all of these thinkers from all of their differences that they do share in common and were in some ways in dialogue with each other, whether they knew about each other or not. And finally, just to reiterate, the idea of art as a way to face and change reality, to bring about beauty and also justice, and as a way to serve the people, I think provide a vision for a new future, even though these thinkers are no longer with us. So music and art for life, not in addition to or instead of life, must be our goal. And I think this intimate connection between art and life that we need to come back to time and time again is indeed the key to overcoming adversity in our lives. Thank you very much for listening. Very much appreciated.
Thank you. Wonderful understanding from you with the three thinkers you have referred to, Mr. Max Roach, Munshi Premchand, and Luke Kelley, and very nicely you have summed up that music and art for life must be our goal and not the way. Now I would just move on to the fourth session and the final session of this international webinar.